keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden share?
All right. The chapter begins again the way that so many of these chapters in Leviticus have begun. The Lord spoke to Moses. Again, there's no way to get around the source of the things that are discussed here. It is from the mouth of the Lord. I want you to notice what it says here in verse 1, though. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. I'm going to stop right there. What's that talking about? Okay, the strange fire event with Nadab and Abihu. That's the two sons of Aaron that are under consideration. He had other sons. So we want to make sure we identify the two sons. When was that recorded? When did we read about that? A while back. Chapter 10, I believe, to be specific, is when that event happens. So we've got chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15. And then chapter 16 says, this happened after the death of the two sons of Aaron. What can we glean from that? Okay, I think you're onto something there. We'll develop that more fully in a moment. The most obvious thing is this: is Leviticus chronological? No. If it was chronological, where would this be? Right after chapter 10. Right after those events. But this is not chronological. And by the way, with it saying after the death of the two sons of Aaron, whether or not it was chronologically immediately following that this happens is also not very clear. It's possible, but what we need to understand is that there's some other impact for the way that this material is organized. We're not just giving a history. The very structure of the book, the organization of the book, has a purpose. And I mentioned, I guess, in the introduction a moment ago, before we started class, that we'd get into this. I'm going to get into it a little earlier than what I was thinking I might. When you look at the book and the way it's arranged, at least up to this point, we're going to go through chapter 16. We're not going to go beyond chapter 16 as far as the organization goes tonight. But you see, the first 7 chapters dealt with what? Anybody remember? It itemized all the different sacrifices. All the different sacrifices, what they were to be, where they would come from, what was to be offered, etc., etc., etc. Chapters 8 and 9 dealt with the priesthood and setting up the priesthood. Chapter 10, we just mentioned it a moment ago, dealt with the death for the improper approach to God. What happens when you don't do what you're supposed to do, well, you die. Chapters 11 through 15 dealt with uncleanness versus cleanness. And now chapter 16 is going to deal with atonement. There is a structure here. There is a flow of thought in the arrangement of the material. That continues, by the way, through the rest of the book. There is a flow. There's something we're supposed to learn from the way he's addressing this. And so we need to keep that in mind. Now, the reason Nadab and Abihu are mentioned at the outset of this chapter is because these instructions about the Day of Atonement uh, needed to begin with a reminder that approaching the presence of God improperly results in death. This is not a matter where it's just, hey, at least I'm getting close to God. Shouldn't really matter how I'm doing it. At least I'm wanting to go to the right place. That's the way a lot of people think about it. And I've even heard people express it by saying, well, they're not there yet, but they're closer than they were. They're moving in the right direction or something along those lines. And there's something to be said for that, but that is not the only thing that matters. Wanting to be with God is not the only thing that matters. And the story of atonement begins by reminding us. And then the next verse, the Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he shall not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat, which is on the ark, lest he die. All right. We got the two sons of Aaron who didn't approach God properly and died. And the next statement is tell Aaron he doesn't get to just walk in there anytime he wants to and approach me anyhow he wants to, because if he does, he's going to die. Leviticus 16 is explaining how man may enter the presence of God and live. We've had an example of how man can approach God and die. We've had warnings about it. Now we're going to find out how it can happen and they live through washing, through sacrifice, through blood, and through atonement. Only after these things are effected can man be in the presence of God. Yes, sir. Nadab and Abihu, Ananias and Sapphira, um, these people did not, I mean, I think they still received patience from God, but we probably received more. Right. So there's a specific and a regulated way to approach God. That's the big picture. The really big picture lesson from this book so far, and it's being underscored here at the outset, and then the next 3 verses, starting in verse 3 and going through verse 6, is about what he has to do to prepare himself before he can go in before the mercy seat. He has to bring a bull for a sin offering and a ram for burnt offerings in verse 3. He has to bathe his body in water. What would happen if he skipped that part? He'd die. I think we would do well to keep that in mind. There's a lot of people running around out there that say things like, well, I don't understand this baptism thing. Why would that matter? Why do we have to do that? I think it's great if we do it. It's an outward sign of this grace that God's shown us, and it's a good testimony to people. But if you don't do it, it's not that big a deal. Really? If Aaron had skipped the bathing part, what would have happened? And by the way, did that bathing really do anything to Aaron? Did it make him a different person? Did it wash his sins off of him? Did it? And the answer to all those things is no. It was a teaching tool. And if he hadn't done it, he would have died. That's the warning that he just received. Remember your sons. And remember, you can't just come in here anyway, anytime that you want to, because if you do, you will die. I'm thinking that he didn't skip that step. Bathed his body in water, he put on the holy linen garments, verse 4. From the congregation, he took 2 goats for sin offering and 1 ram for burnt offering, verse 5. And he first offers the bull as a sin offering for himself and his house in verse 6. And what we see here is, in the function of how this is playing out, everybody had a sin problem, and everybody's sins had to be addressed. And there was even an order for it. As the high priest, Aaron had to first be cleansed and atoned for before he could act on behalf of the people and cleanse and atone them. Nobody approaches God without atonement. That's the lesson. Nobody approaches God without atonement. He wasn't exempt. In fact, you can make an argument that he required even a larger sacrifice. What did he have to sacrifice for himself? A bull. What was the sacrifice for the people? A goat. Then verses 7 through 10. These goats, they're presented before the Lord, and he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So they're set before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and lots are cast at that point. What is lots? I don't know what the mechanism was, but it's some kind of random selection process, whether it's a dice roll or choose the stick, or I don't know what process they used in casting lots. There are people who have studied that and have ideas, and they may be right. I don't know. None of us were there to see it. So I in the Bible never read a description of what casting lots appeared like. So I don't have any biblical basis upon which to draw any conclusions. But it was just a random selection mechanism. And one of the goats was chosen for the Lord. And what was the other goat chosen for, according to verse 8? All right, depending on what translation you read. Azazel. Okay, what is that? Yeah, yeah. They don't know. No, nobody knows exactly what that word means. Yeah. We'll talk about it maybe a little more in a moment. I think I have some stuff in my notes later on about it. But one of the potential translations is that it is the goat of removal. So one of them was presented to the Lord, and one of them was used to carry something away. Thus the name scapegoat. The problem with the word scapegoat is it has come to mean something in our modern usage that really gets in the way of understanding what this is about. What is a scapegoat today? Exactly. It is one who without any fault is accused and is blamed for something and bears the consequences of the blame. There is nothing about that fits this picture. And I've heard it explained that way before. But what's the problem? The problem here is the scapegoat is the goat that doesn't die. If the goat is bearing the sins in the sense of taking the guilt and responsibility, what's the penalty of sin? Yeah, the scapegoat should die. But in fact, the scapegoat does not die. The scapegoat lives in freedom. So that is not a good way of understanding that word. Um, it's presented alive before the Lord, and then it's sent into the wilderness and allowed to live in the wilderness. So two things happen, and this is what we need to understand. The reason there's two goats is there's two different things happening, and the picture of those two things is being painted for us. Sin is atoned for. What does the word atone mean? Most literally, it means cover, to cover. How is sin atoned for? By the blood of the goat that's sacrificed to God. They kill that goat, they take its blood, they pour it out at the altar, and that blood covers the sins of the people. Then the second thing that happens is sin is removed. And that's the role of the scapegoat. And the passage that immediately pops into my mind is the passage in the Psalms that says, as far as the east is from the west, so far God has taken our sins. This idea of they laid hands on this goat, they presented it before God, they laid hands on it, and then they just sent it off into the wilderness, and it just carried the sins away. But that's the most important thing, is the idea of removal. It's not just a covering. It's not just that God doesn't see the sin. It's that the sin is carried away. And those are two different acts. Well, that's later in the discussion. So that's why there's two goats. That's one that, by the way, they're both presented before the Lord, but one is sacrificed to the Lord and one is set free. The high priest then enters the most holy place with the blood. Verses 11 through 19. So Aaron kills the bull for his own offering in verse 11. He brings the incense inside the veil so that the blood covers, um, so that I'll get this out in a minute. He brings the incense inside the veil so the cloud covers the mercy seat, which is where God is. He sprinkles the blood of the bull on and before the mercy seat. That's verse 14. He kills the goat for the sin offering for the people in verse 15. He brings its blood inside the veil and sprinkles it on the mercy seat in verse 15. So first was his sacrifice, his blood, and then the blood for the sacrifice of the people. And so he's making atonement, and he's making atonement for a lot of different things here. He's making atonement for the holy place, for the tent of meeting, for the altar, for the priest, and for all the assembly. And that's cataloged in verses 16 through 19 here. That all this is going on. Now, why all the cleansing of the tabernacle and its instruments have to be under consideration here? Well, you have to remember how chapter 15 ended. If you go back to chapter 15 and verse 31, do you remember what it said about the cleanness and uncleanness stuff? He says, "Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle." So, in their dwelling in and around the tabernacle, their uncleanness defiled the tabernacle. So, before any of this stuff can happen with the atonement, the tabernacle has to be atoned for, and the people have to be atoned for, so that God can be present and be with them so that they don't die. It, we're going to do that at the end of the discussion. We're going to tie all this together thanks to Hebrews chapter 11. And I will tell you, I think it's important to note what I noted a few moments ago, and that is the connection to the tabernacle we generally make in terms of the church, but there's also an aspect of this that we can talk about in terms of ourselves. And I think that is important to realize as well. But our bodies are also a tabernacle of God. And so this applies to us as individuals with respect to that. And I think we have to see both aspects of it. We pollute ourselves, we pollute the local assembly unless we're atoned for. And that's the teaching here. Everything had to be atoned for, so everything was clean because God has no fellowship with darkness. So the scapegoat then bears away the sins of the people. Verse 21. Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the sons of Israel and their transgressions in regard to their sins. And he shall lay them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who stands in readiness. I got to stop here for a minute. Does anybody believe that he recounted every single sinful event that every one of them committed over the course of the year? That is not what it's talking about. This is a general recognition of the universality of their sins. The sins of right. So he lays both hands on the goat. He confesses over it the iniquities and transgressions of the people. The goat bears their sins away into a remote area, verse 22, and the goat grows free. That's how verse 22 ends. Again, I want to make this clear. I've said it already once tonight. I'm going to say it again because I want to make this very, very clear. This is not a scapegoat in the sense that the goat is receiving the guilt and the blame of the people's sins, else the punishment would be death. This is a vehicle of removal, carrying away. It's a carrying away. And that's the way the word is being used. Now, I will put a plug in here. We're not in a full discussion of this yet. We're going to get into it at the end of the lesson. But there's some messianic teaching that has to be noted here from these things a little bit later on. We're going to see in the book of Hebrews specifically, referring to this practice, noting that the bodies of the sin offerings whose blood were brought into the sanctuary burned outside the camp. That's Hebrews 13:11. Hebrews then connects these events to Jesus, who suffered outside the gate. And it shows that the events of the Day of Atonement were part of a larger pattern that is later explained. I don't think it was explained to them. I don't think they understood it at all. And again, that's why I go to where I started this lesson. This was not recorded for them. It was recorded for us so that the instruction we receive in Hebrews 11, 12, and 13 actually makes sense to us. This day is an annual statute. It happened every year on the 10th day of the 7th month. And that's one of the things that I intended to actually look up, is to see if there was any significance about that day. And I failed to do that. That's the one thing I didn't get around to doing. So I don't know if there's something significant about that day other than it was the Day of Atonement or not, but I will try to remember to do that research. But on this day, the people are to afflict themselves. What does that mean, afflict themselves? It's not sadomasochism, okay? They were to deny themselves and do no work. It was a day of fasting and not working. On the Day of Atonement, there's these sacrifices that are being made to cleanse them from all their sins before the Lord. And it's a statute forever for Israel, verses 31 through 34. And it's very clear. Look at verse 34. It's very clear in this final verse. Now you shall have this as a permanent statute to make atonement for the sins of Israel, for all of their sins once every year. And just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so he did. This was an annual thing that had to be done every single year. Now, it becomes a central day. Anybody know what it's called today? Yom Kippur. So if you hear him talking about Yom Kippur, that's the Day of Atonement. And apparently the word Kippur is related to the Hebrew word that's translated atonement. Either that or it's related to, I think it's that one. I think it's the word that means cover. So it became a central day of cleansing for the nation. And we're going to find out in a moment that it was intended to be a reminder. So we want to talk for just a moment about the theological movement of the chapter, and then get into the nuts and bolts of why this matters for us. The chapter reveals some clear movement. Access to God is restricted. It starts with that. You can't just go in. Access to God is restricted. The priest has to be cleansed. The blood has to be brought into the most holy place. The atonement has to be made for the sanctuary and the people. Sin has to be carried away. the people are cleansed before the Lord. That's the process of this chapter. And it's stated relatively clearly in verse 30. For on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you. You shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. Shall language is interesting. This is written ahead of centuries and centuries of Days of Atonements. So shall language is appropriate for that. But it has another level of import as well. It has to do with what John raised a little earlier. And that is, what kind of blood are we talking about in this chapter? There are two kinds of animals that are identified. What are they? Does that language ring familiar to anybody? Blood of bulls and goats. So just kind of keep that in mind. And yet here we are reading in verse 30 that says, on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you. Were they cleansed or not? You shall be clean before the Lord. Were they clean or not? Why does it matter? Well, sin separates people from God. Atonement requires blood. There's blood all over this chapter. Quite literally. A mediator is required to approach God. The people don't get to go in and offer this sacrifice. Only the high priest can do it. A mediator is required. Sin must be atoned for, and it must be removed. And cleansing allows God then to dwell among his people. Would God have continued with the people if they forsook this atonement? Now, later in Scripture, there's some explanation that these things were a shadow of a greater reality. Hebrews describes the high priest entering the most holy place once a year with blood for himself and the people in Hebrews 9, verses 6 and 7. And then it explains that Christ entered the true holy place, not one made with hands, but the one made without hands. He went into heaven itself. And he didn't do it with the blood of bulls and goats. He did it with his own blood. Hebrews also states that the law has a shadow of the good things to come. It was just the shadow image of what God was doing through Jesus. The substance is Christ. That's, by the way, Hebrews 10 in verse 1. And while the priest offered sacrifices repeatedly, Christ only had to do it once. Why? Well, let's just read it. Read with me in Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4, and then verse 12, and we'll let this stand as the conclusion. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? And so, if these things actually made the people perfect, it wouldn't have had to be done every year. They wouldn't have had consciousness of sins anymore. But these sacrifices, or in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And that's what was all over this chapter, bulls and goats. Now, verse 12. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. That language, he sat down at the right hand of God, simply means that his atonement work was done. These things were merely a shadow representation of what God was doing for man through Christ. Why were the atonement sacrifices of the law of Moses effective? And they were. I believe they were. The text in verse 30 is very clear. They were cleansed. But why were they effective? Because of what God was accomplishing in Jesus. Because the blood of bulls and goats is not sufficient to atone for and carry away sins. You can't blame an animal for the sins of man. It took, that's why God had to come in flesh and live as a man. So he could be a sacrifice that was sufficient to perfect atonement and to once and for all carry our sins away, that we don't have to bear the guilt and the penalty. And that is the crux of the gospel. Way back here in Leviticus 16, being demonstrated for us so that we never forget that the only way we have access to God is because of Jesus, which is why he calls himself the way. No one comes to the Father except by me. Appreciate everybody's participation and your attention tonight. There we go.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.